you're like us, you're probably tired of flipping through outdated and expensive regulation books and struggling to understand the rule or guidance you're after. E-Regs is the first web and mobile app version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, helping fleets of all types and sizes better access and understand their regulatory obligations. E-Regs is always up to date and allows fleet safety professionals to not only read the rules, but also dig into FMCSA guidance and learn more about complex regulatory topics from industry experts. Highlight, bookmark, and take detailed notes right from the app and access them on any of your devices. And easily share a digital version of the regulations with your drivers so that they too can better understand the rules. E-Regs was developed by safety professionals for safety professionals. Try it out for free at eregs.app. All right, hey everyone, welcome to episode 49 of Trucksafe Live, show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon. Trucksafe and Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Got a full house with me today. Got Rob Carpenter, Brian Runnels, and Sam Watts. Welcome, guys.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
Going.
Good.
It's going. Good to hear. Well, we all are here. Trucksafe team, most of us anyway, missing Jared and Tyler. But we got an important topic to talk about today, one that seems to be continuing to cause a lot of problems year after year after year after year after year, something that we are constantly harping on with our clients, and that's personal conveyance. And you might be asking, what could possibly be new about personal conveyance? Well, not a whole lot, other than CVSA is going to petition the FMCSA for like the 25th time to get a handle on personal conveyance. So that's what's new. So we're going to discuss that, but also, kind of more broadly about personal conveyance and some of the things we've seen fleets do with it and how to get control of it, that type of stuff. So that is the plan for today's show. Before we get there, I want to say quick thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, which is Project 61. Project 61 aims to improve the life expectancy of CDL drivers by raising awareness, providing resources, and educating drivers on a healthier lifestyle. Learn how you can support the movement over at project-61.org. So thanks to them. And then some things going on at Trucksafe that we should talk about. First up, if you're not a member of our Trucksafe network, I'd encourage you to join it. It's free to join over at trucksafenetwork.com, or scan that QR code on the screen and download the app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. The network is a place that we developed for fleet safety professionals to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and also access all of our DOT-related content that we push out, including our in-depth webinars on various topics. So be sure to join that. We hope to see you over there. And then our upcoming Fleet Compliance Boot Camp. This is our 2-day in-person conference that we put on each year. This year's boot camp, September 3rd through 4th in Indianapolis. Thanks to DriveWise for sponsoring this year's boot camp. We hope to see you there. It's always a great networking opportunity for fleet safety teams. We usually have about 100 or so fleet safety professionals in attendance, and we spend 2 days talking about nothing but DOT compliance and best practices for managing a DOT compliance program. Trucksafebootcamp.com is where you'll find the details on that if you want to join us. Registration always fills up pretty quickly, so we encourage you to register sooner rather than later if you want to join us there. We will all be there along with others, so hope to see you there. And then lastly, I'll just mention our newsletter. If you are looking for a resource to stay on top of the ever-changing regulatory environment for motor carriers. Our newsletter is a great place to do that. Trucksafe.com/subscribe is where you can do that. Pushing out a lot of breaking news. Had a couple things this week, which we should move into talking about, which we will do in a minute. So that's pretty much it for Trucksafe news. Anything else I'm missing, guys?
I don't think so.
Brian?
Nope. I think you're good. I think we got it all.
All right, we hit it all. All right, so let's move on to some industry news. Well, first of all, this isn't really industry news, but Brian and I are in Indianapolis, and May is a big time of the year for Indianapolis. We got the Indy 500 coming up, but the one I'm more interested in, did you guys see this? The Weenie 500 is going to be tomorrow, Friday. They're going to be racing the Wienermobiles around the track, so that's pretty exciting. So looking forward to that. Brian, you're not driving
How
one
many
of
do
those, are
they
you?
got?
What'd you say?
How many Wienermobiles are actually going to be on the track?
I think I saw 4 or 5 is what I heard. So I didn't realize there were that many, but apparently there are. So it should be a good race.
They were hiring drivers for those things at the beginning of the season. I'm wondering if those, I hope those are the folks that are not driving them around the racetrack.
I'm a little surprised that you haven't applied for that job yet, Brian, to be honest.
Nah, that's one I haven't gone after. No.
Okay.
All right. So, like, as safety guys now, is that a commercial motor vehicle, the Wienermobile?
We've had this conversation. I've had this conversation with others in the past. That's a good question. I read somewhere that they're built, or at least some of them are built on like a what was the name of the car? Not the smart cars, the Mini Cooper chassis. They're built on like a Mini Cooper chassis, which I wouldn't think even putting that big wiener on top of it would push it over 10,000 pounds, but I don't know. I haven't seen a 10,000 pound weenie.
There's so many jokes right now that we're just not going to get into.
There's a reason Rob and I are not saying anything.
Yeah.
Because it'll go south quick.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on from that.
There was, I did do an art. This is the second thing you've shared about the Wienermobile, Brandon, in like 6 months. So
yeah, there was a crash.
I don't know. It was like 4 or 5 months ago, I think. Mm-hmm. But I think these guys drive for a year at a time, and then they transition out and they hire a new guy or girl or whoever is going to drive this thing. But I think it only pays like catch up in like 40,000 a year or something. I mean, it's not a lot. So,
and all the wieners you can hope for.
Yeah.
All right. The other thing that's worth mentioning, obviously the big news from earlier this week was additional details we received on the English proficiency rule. FMCSA on May 20th issued its what it calls an enforcement policy, providing additional guidance to law enforcement as to how they are to test drivers during roadside inspections for their English proficiency. This is coming on the heels of President Trump's executive order from April that demanded or that mandated the FMCSA and CVSA to once again place English proficiency violations into the category of out-of-service violations, so that if a driver is unable to effectively communicate with law enforcement or read road signs during a roadside inspection, they will be placed out of service. So this guidance provides a little bit more detail, but still leaves some unanswered questions, namely what specific questions the officers are going to ask of the drivers in their driver interview portion of the assessment. So the policy says it's going to be a 2-step assessment. The officer is going to initiate the roadside inspection in English. If they think that the driver is struggling with English, then they will initiate this 2-step process. First step will be a driver interview, where they are supposed to be asking specific questions. Those questions were redacted in the public version of the enforcement policy, so we don't know exactly what the questions are going to be. And then if the driver fails that portion of the assessment, they will be placed out of service. If they pass that portion, it will move on to step 2, which is a traffic sign recognition test, where, as I understand it, they will be shown a series of road signs and asked to explain their meaning. And what those road signs are were also redacted in the policy memorandum. or the enforcement policy. So we don't know what road signs they will be, but that's how the process is going to work. And if the driver fails that process, then they will be placed out of service, and that's how it will work. Guys, any thoughts on that guidance that came out this week?
After the first guy does this test and we actually know what the questions are, that's going to spread around, right? So then everybody's going to have the cheat sheet that's been redacted. And I mean, does it change after that? You know what I mean? Are we going to try to continuously modify the cheat sheet so that the questions are consistently changing?
Well, I know they do that with Indiana's just your driver's license test. There, I don't know if there's about a half a dozen different versions of it that, the one you get is pulled at random. So you just can't memorize straight through the book. So I'm wondering if it'll be something like that, because you're exactly right. Memorization is a wonderful thing. And if all they have to do is teach the drivers to memorize certain phrases or certain answers, then the test is horrifically flawed.
Yeah, that's probably the reason they didn't include that in the memo. They don't want people to start preparing for it and just memorize it. But at the same time, you're right, Rob, the first person that does this, and it's going to be out in the open. In fact, if anybody's interested, head over to trucksafe.com. We posted an article on this enforcement policy earlier this week. And in doing the research for that, I came across a 2012 policy memorandum from FMCSA back from when the agency was rolling out its cross-border trucking pilot program, where it was going to expand the area where cross-border drivers from Mexico could operate into the U.S. And as part of that program, they emphasized the English language proficiency requirement, and they included in that policy memorandum a two-step process that included questions for a driver interview and signs, and those are not redacted in that 2012 memorandum. In fact, here they are. So I imagine if it's not the exact same as what was in this 2012 memorandum, it's probably something close to this. These are the signs that were in that 2012 policy memorandum. Really no surprises here. I think the way this worked in 2012 was there's 22 signs here. That memorandum back then said that the drivers had to be able to explain at least 19 of those 22 in order to pass that part of the assessment. So that's over at trucksafe.com in our article section if you're interested in that. Let's see here. Greg's asking, English proficiency, does that override intrastate rules? It's an interesting question. It's one that we've had to address for a number of clients, and it's a good question that I don't, it kind of depends on how the individual state at issue has adopted the federal motor carrier safety regulations. So as we've talked about in several other contexts, every state in the country has, to some extent, adopted the federal motor carrier safety regulations and made them applicable even to intrastate commerce, including the English proficiency requirement. That's one that they have to adopt for intrastate commerce. The trick is going to be, some states have raised the weight threshold for the vehicles and the drivers to whom their intrastate rules apply to. Texas, for example, has raised the weight threshold from 10,000 pounds to 26,000 pounds. So if you operate a vehicle under 26,001 pounds in Texas, you're not even regulated if you stay intrastate only. So you would have that universe of drivers getting out of the English proficiency requirement, for example, is how I think it will play out. But yeah, it's a good question that we don't have nailed down completely yet.
So here's a question that I'll throw out to everybody, and I don't know if there's an answer. And I will admit, I know of this English proficiency thing, but I have not had time to really dive too deep into it. Is there anything in there that holds the company accountable for hiring non-English speaking drivers out there? Is there any language like that in there?
Well, nothing specific, but obviously if their drivers are getting tagged with English proficiency violations, it's going to jack up their driver fitness score, right, and then they're going to be potentially prioritized for audit, I think is kind of the idea. But you're right. I mean, that seems like the obvious place to put the onus, right, is these motor carriers that are hiring these drivers and putting them on the roads as part of the qualification process. If they aren't already, they really should have something baked into that process where they are testing for this. And if the driver applicants can't sufficiently speak English in that context, then they shouldn't be qualified to begin with. But yeah, nothing directly in the enforcement policy related to that. So
I don't know if you guys have had any calls yet, but I've had like 6 asking me if I had a sign test that they could
really?
they could as carriers to provide to their. One of them is one of our famous clients down in Florida. So.
Well, there you go. Go to trucksafe.com and you can find that list of signs there, and you can use that. But yeah, so that's English proficiency. Our last Trucksafe Live episode from a couple weeks ago was all about English proficiency. We had a roundtable discussion all about that topic. So if you're interested, go back and watch that one, and we will continue to monitor the issue and report on it as any news comes out about it. Anything else, guys?
Side note there too, Rob. Yeah, side note on that, Rob. You could probably direct them to whatever state they are in for their driver's license requirements. I mean, because those books all have the signs in them too. At least they used to.
Yeah. I know in Virginia you have to pass 100%. Virginia, if you miss one sign, I mean, at any licensing level, you got to start over.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be a good place for it. And also that's kind of another issue that hasn't been resolved through all of this is, are we going to somehow tighten this issue up at the CDL school level, which also seems to be a pretty big problem with these CDL schools pushing out these drivers, many of whom can't sufficiently read or speak English and so aren't qualified. So we'll have to wait and see how that gets resolved. But anyway, the only other thing I saw come through this week was actually a post that you posted, Rob. This is you put out an article on FreightWaves about unlicensed, unqualified drivers. I think you cited to Adam Wingfield's report that nearly 4% of truck drivers on U.S. highways don't have a valid CDL. That seems pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I have beat the drum on this licensing standard issue forever. I mean, everybody got really focused on the narrative builder of English-speaking drivers, but when you have a lot of people will argue the fact that, hey, these are teen drivers that I talk about, but you can get a CDL at 18 in under some circumstances. So literally 2 years after you get a license without any experience at all, you can go get a CDL. So if you get in a vehicle and you drive for 2 years not knowing how to drive and you practice doing it the wrong way, and then you go get a CDL, I mean, what do you think the outcome is going to be? So my argument has always been we've got a licensing standard issue. So it's really who we're putting on the road and how well equipped they are from a knowledge standpoint to operate commercial vehicles or any vehicle at all. I mean, if you watch my videos every day on LinkedIn, we've got plenty of evidence out there that say the roads and the highways are a pretty wild place.
Yeah. Check out that article if you're interested in the topic. It's at FreightWaves, and also Rob's pushing out a lot of articles on FreightWaves, so be sure to check those out. All right, so moving on to the topic of today, which again is personal conveyance. It's a perennial problem that fleet safety professionals like us love to hate, with log falsifications stemming from personal conveyance misuse continuing to top the charts of the most common violations discovered in roadside inspections and DOT audits. Many in the industry, including most notably the CVSA, continue to clamor for a regulatory overhaul. In fact, CVSA just recently announced that it will be petitioning the FMCSA for a third time to put tighter limitations on PC use, perhaps similar to Canada's regime, which places distance limitations on PC use. So in short, personal conveyance is a hot topic for fleets and their drivers, and it causes a lot of problems, so we thought it would be a good time to jump on here and give our 2 cents on the topic for what it's worth, which is not much, and offer some tips on how fleets and drivers might better manage personal conveyance use to minimize violations. As we go along here, we're always interested in your all's take on it, so anybody watching, throw your thoughts or comments or questions in the chat, and we will get to them as we go along here. But Sam, since you're the guest today, first time guest on the show, I'm going to turn it over to you to maybe explain for anybody who's watching who may not be familiar with personal conveyance or just vaguely familiar with it. If you can kind of break it down for them, and what is it and why is it a problem?
Well, yeah, thank you for putting me on the spot like that. Glad we talked about this beforehand. No, you're exactly right. Like we were chatting even beforehand. Like it just seems to be one of those topics that a lot of people don't understand, or the thing I see a lot of is a lot of people think they understand it, and then they go and use it, and then it's used horribly incorrectly. So the way I always try to explain it to drivers, dispatchers, whoever I'm talking to, is basically, and now this is not a hard steady rule, but this is a good framework, so to say, is that if you are told or instructed to move your truck, you can't use PC with that. If you are doing it purely on because you need to do something that is not work related, then you can use PC. Now, again, there are caveats to all of that, and that's where a lot of people try to get into trouble. The biggest one, and maybe you guys can talk to this as well, the biggest one that I always seem to come across is a driver, they try to get away with, like, they deliver somewhere and then they go to their next shipper, their next pickup, and they try to use PC on that because, hey, I'm empty, I'm not pulling anything. That's not right. Or the other big one that a lot of people seem to forget, and this is one that I actually have a bone to pick as well. I get what the FMCSA is doing, but at the same time, whatever, is when you're empty and you drive home. Like the FMCSA, according to the rule books, you can't use PC to go home. And again, I get what the drivers are saying, and quite frankly, I'm on their side with a lot of it. But they really want to use PC to go home because they're not on the clock anymore. They're empty and they're going home time. I get it, but you can't do that. That's always a big one, and that's the one that seems to get people in trouble. Like I said, it ends in a falsification of a log, and then you got that under CSA data. So, but yeah, basically, I always tell drivers, if dispatch tells you to do something or go somewhere, you can't use PC on that.
Yeah, I mean, what it boils down to is PC, personal conveyance, is driving a commercial motor vehicle in off-duty status for hours of service purposes. There are several problems with this, as you would expect. Point of the hours of service rules, as we all know, is to cut down on fatigued driving and to make sure drivers are complying with strict hours around their working time and driving time. And so personal conveyance is using a commercial motor vehicle, as Sam said, for your own personal reasons, not work related. And the FMCSA has allowed you to, in certain enumerated circumstances, to log that as off-duty personal conveyance time. But that is fraught with some issues, right? Because if we are operating in off-duty status, then there's the potential that you could be misusing that to get around your substantive hours of service limitations, which, spoiler alert, happens all the time. And it is one of the few remaining ways now with ELDs installed in trucks that drivers can try and conceal a substantive hours of service rule or violation. And for that reason, it causes a lot of problems. And also because the FMCSA's guidance on the topic has wavered and changed over the years, and also because it's not all that clear. It's guidance you'll find on their website. It's not baked into their regulations. And it is guidance that lists out, I don't know, guys, a couple dozen different scenarios, some of which it says are legitimate uses of personal conveyance, and some of which it says are illegitimate uses of personal conveyance. But the issue we run into a lot, I think, collectively, is that drivers and carriers inevitably find situations that don't fit neatly into those enumerated examples in the FMCSA's guidance. And so you're left to make a judgment call of whether that use is a legitimate use of personal conveyance or not. And even if you make that call, then an officer or the FMCSA may not agree with your call. And so all that's to say, as I said at the start, personal conveyance use, misuse is one of the top violations discovered in roadside inspections and in audits, and it is causing tremendous trouble for a lot of fleets. And that's why we really need to get a handle on it. So next question then is, I wanted to ask you all, maybe we'll go around the horn here, some common examples or common scenarios that you've seen that are legitimate uses of personal conveyance. And then we'll do the same thing with impermissible uses of personal conveyance that you tend to see. So we'll start with most common good uses of personal conveyance. Rob, I'll start with you.
Oh, Lord. The most common good uses, let's say you're at a shipper and you are out of hours. Can you drive to the next spot? And that's one of the big ones that comes up on LinkedIn, Facebook, Reddit, you name it. Everybody argues that safe haven exists, and it's this broad categorization of meaning. But generally, I tell people, yes, if you are at a shipper and you are out of time, then you can go to the next available safe spot. That doesn't mean the next truck stop. That might just be the next available parking spot outside of that shipper. So it doesn't mean that you get to drive all the way back to the terminal or all the way to wherever you feel like going for dinner at the Country Skillet at the TA or wherever. But that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that gets broadly broadcasted. So I'd say that's probably a big misconception. I'd say one that's a common legitimate use is if you're unladen, you're not in furtherance of a load or the next load, and you're going to go home, right? Like there's nothing to do with the past load or the next load, and you're not acting in furtherance of commerce. One of the big ones I think that we see is drive away. A lot of drive away drivers will, the truck is the cargo. They'll drop a truck and deliver it and then fly to the next truck. But how do you calculate that time? Does that have to be accounted for, since you are technically in furtherance of the next load, the next pickup?
Yeah.
So
we've addressed that specifically in that context, and it does get tricky because putting aside personal conveyance, there's a separate travel time exemption in the regulations that talks about drivers flying to a location, but that's kind of neither here nor there. All right, Brian, do you have any, have you seen any good uses of personal conveyance?
Yeah, the simple ones, going to get something to eat, coming back, picking up the load or picking up the trailer. That going to take a shower, going to somewhere, and just going somewhere to do something that you want to do, and then coming right back to where that load or trailer is to take off. You drop the trailer at the door. They say, hey, it's going to be 2 hours, 3 hours. You're free to leave. So then you can go do that. That's the simplest form.
Yeah, I mean, that's the quintessential example of legitimate personal conveyance, is going to get something to eat or going to an entertainment facility. I like how they use that term in the personal conveyance guidance, like we don't know what that means. Entertainment facility. But I mean, that's the quintessential. You're off duty, you're doing these things on your own time, classic use of personal conveyance. Sam, you got any others? Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's what it was meant for.
Yeah.
And nothing more, nothing less. That's what it was meant for. But go ahead, Sam.
Well, the one that a lot of people can use, and it's more towards more like construction type vehicles, is you can commute. You can use personal conveyance for commuting to a home terminal from a job site. And I don't have the exact regulation pulled up in front of me because there is some language in there. But that's where a lot of over-the-road carriers sometimes get in trouble, is they're reading, because in the construction world, there's some language in there that says you can commute from a job site back to a terminal or back to home. And again, I don't have the exact terminology in front of me, but carriers will interpret that as well. I can go from a shipper or receiver back to home. And that's what usually kind of gets them in trouble. The other big one that I see a lot of times is drivers will drive their 11 hours and then say, okay, now I'm going to put in PC and find, your safe haven. And it's like, no, guys, you got to find that before you get to the end of your 11 hours. That's where I see some of the carriers I watch after. That's where their drivers get into trouble, is put my 11 hours in PC, drive on to the truck stop.
Yeah, safe haven is my favorite. You hear that thrown around as if it means something. Literally, the guidance doesn't even use that term. And you're right, Sam. When the one allowance that the guidance allows for something that may seem like a safe haven is the one that Rob mentioned, which is you run out of time at a shipper's or receiver's facility while you're sitting there waiting to be loaded or unloaded. And the guidance says, in that case alone, you're allowed to get to the next safe resting location. I guess that could be considered a safe haven. But that is legitimately the only instance where that is permissible use of personal conveyance. More often than not, when drivers are talking about safe haven, they're talking about, oh, I was driving down the road, ran out of time while I was driving. Now I got to get to a safe resting. No, that's not how it works. That's a violation. That's a log falsification if you do that, if you switch to personal conveyance while you run out of hours while you're driving down the road. FMCSA will tell you that's poor planning on your part or the carrier's part that dispatched you. And so, that is not a legitimate use of personal conveyance. So let's clear that up. Let's make sure we're all on the same page there. All right. I've got a lot of comments here on YouTube or on LinkedIn. Let me see here. Kevin says, with the traveling home example, we want to be sure to look at the continuation of a trip. That's right. And I think you all have kind of mentioned this. The travel back home can be a gray area. It's probably one of the bigger gray areas that we encounter with our clients is, driver drops a load at a receiver's facility, and now they need to get back home across the country. Maybe they don't have another dispatch trip after that, and so they're going to drive across the country to get back to their home. Is that a legitimate use of personal conveyance going back home? It's a gray area because if you look strictly at the FMCSA's guidance and the FAQs they have on this topic, you will see language in there that says that a return trip home from a receiver's facility is not a legitimate use of personal conveyance. The DOT considers that a continuation of the trip. And so you have to be careful because a strict reading of that guidance would say, no, that is not a legitimate use of personal conveyance, a return trip home, even if you don't have another dispatch trip coming up. So that makes it a little tough in that situation.
The one way that Brandon, the way it was handled with the company I drove for was we could, granted, and we're going to talk about it later, we had a limit on our PC, but if we had to use it, we could use it to go home. But we got paid out of the house. So wherever that your next load started, you needed to log your coming out of the house, even if you were going right back to where you left from.
Mm-hmm.
But since you were getting mileage pay from that location, from your home location, you had to start logging immediately when you left.
Yeah, the problem I see with that, though, is that there's other FMCSA guidance that said whether or not a driver's getting paid for the segment that they're driving has no bearing on whether they're on duty or off duty for hours of service purposes. So that's the argument. That's the counter argument to that is FMCSA has said that they don't care whether the driver's getting paid or not for purposes of determining whether it's on duty or off duty, I suppose.
Maybe that was the wool they were pulling over our eyes to just say, log it out of the house.
I was just getting out of having to pay you guys, I think. Mitchell's saying it comes down to commerce. The commute is completely fine as long as the driver isn't furthering commerce for the carrier and not a continuation of a trip. Yeah, I mean, there is, as Sam mentioned, there is that commerce allowance or commute allowance in the personal conveyance guidance. Where I've seen drivers and carriers get confused on that, though, is the one example that Sam mentioned, which is if you just read that guidance standing alone, it will say something to the effect of a legitimate use of personal conveyance is commuting to and from the driver's home and the carrier's terminal is one example, or to and from the driver's home and a job site is another example, or to and from the home and a trailer drop lot is the third example. Well, that middle one, job site, that sounds exactly what I need. I mean, that's a carrier's or shipper's facility, right? That's me commuting to my home after working at the job site, which is my customer facility. Unfortunately, that's what it sounds like because that's how it's written, and the FMCSA did a terrible job of writing that. They didn't think that through. So what they had to do subsequently, so many people got that misimpression from that wording of the guidance that they had to come out with a subsequent guidance. So there's guidance to the guidance. And the guidance to the guidance will tell you that's not what they meant by job site. What they mean by job site is the example you gave, Sam, which is construction companies. And you'll read this in the guidance to the guidance. What we meant by that is a situation where a construction company sets up essentially a temporary terminal at a construction site. You'll see this a lot with, construction companies setting up like a trailer
Concrete
there
plant.
at the concrete plant where they're that becomes the carrier's terminal in essence for them. And so that's what they meant by job site and the commute time allowance for that. But yeah, that's a very common misunderstanding of personal conveyance, and that runs carriers into a lot of trouble. All right. Any others that we kind of bled right into misuses of personal conveyance there? Any other big ones that you're seeing?
I'd say a big one is trying to find parking like that. I mean, it kind of goes back to the safe haven mentality, but I think part of the issue that CVSA, FMCSA has shot down CVSA's request 2 or 3 times in the past is flexibility for drivers. And I think the parking issue is one of those things. It's hard to solve the PC issue with misuse issue without solving the parking issue. Because if you don't have somewhere to park, I mean, you've got a problem. You gotta annotate the time as something.
Yeah. You end up spending an hour looking for parking, and if you hadn't planned for an hour's worth of looking for parking, you're either going to misuse personal conveyance and put yourself in off duty, or you're gonna have the substantive drive time or on duty time violation. So we should point out, I mean, this is something to consider as if you're a carrier or a driver. One question we get asked a lot is it better, I don't know that we get asked this question, but this is our question we pose to them. Is it better to have your drivers get hit with a log falsification from a PC misuse violation, or just to incur the substantive hours violation that they would have incurred had they just left themselves in driving status? And my argument has always been you're better off to just incur the substantive violation. You're doing yourself more harm by mislogging yourself as personal conveyance for a couple of different reasons. Namely that if you look at the fleet as a whole, when we do mock audits, for example, like the DOT would do an audit, we're looking at hours of service, a sample of hours of service records for however many drivers we're looking at for that particular carrier. And what you'll find nowadays is that, relatively speaking, compared to log falsifications, you'll find relatively few substantive hours violations in that log audit, meaning 11-hour violations or 14-hour violations or 70-hour violations. But what you'll find a lot of are log falsification violations that get all lumped together in that group called log falsification. Some of those are personal conveyance misuse. Others are drivers logging off duty while they're fueling. There's many different ways that you can end up with a log falsification violation. And the problem is those all get grouped into one category called log falsification. So you end up with this big group of log falsifications and a relatively small group of substantive hours violations. And in the audit context, what the investigators are looking for are what are called critical level violations, which means a 10% violation rate or more based on the logs they're looking at. If I'm looking at 100 logs, if I find 10 or more 11-hour violations out of that universe, then that's a critical level violation. Same thing with log falsifications. And so the impact of the log falsifications is that because they're all grouped together, it's much easier to end up with a 10% violation rate and end up with a critical level violation because of that. Whereas had your drivers just incurred the substantive 11-hour violation or 14-hour violation, it probably wouldn't have resulted in a critical level violation in that audit context. So for that reason, and because log falsifications are heavily weighted in roadside inspections, it's, in my opinion, better just to incur. If you're put with the choice of incurring a substantive time violation to find parking, for example, or to flip myself into personal conveyance status unlawfully, I would take the substantive violation if I were you as a driver. You will be better off in the long run. All right, so you mentioned, Rob, CVSA's petition. That's kind of why we're here. Let's jump over to that. So here was an article kind of summarizing CVSA's planned petition. They haven't filed this yet, I don't think. But this, like I said, this will be the third time that they've petitioned the FMCSA for the FMCSA to put tighter controls on personal conveyance use. So CVSA is the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. This is the group that kind of represents law enforcement officers across the country. You can see in this article, according to CVSA, 38% of drivers were found to be misusing the personal conveyance provision. And then it goes on to explain what is personal conveyance, which we just did. Here's what they are going to request FMCSA to do. You could see here they are going to request a 2-hour per day limit on personal conveyance use. Right now, there is no hours or distance limitation on personal conveyance use, as long as it's legitimate. But they are requesting a maximum of 2 hours per day personal conveyance limit. We'll talk about our thoughts on that here in a second. But then they're also going to make additional recommendations to FMCSA, which are to, number one, prohibit time spent in personal conveyance from being classified as off-duty. I don't know that I've thought through what that does exactly. Maybe we could talk about that here in a second. But then another one is to provide written guidance stating drivers cannot use personal conveyance to reach a safe haven after hitting their HOS limits. That kind of gets to the concern we already hit on, which is there is no such thing as a safe haven. And then to clarify what constitutes enhancing the operational readiness. That's a phrase that's used directly in the FMCSA guidance as an impermissible use of personal conveyance. Enhancing the operational readiness. What does that mean exactly is the CVSA's question. And then to specify that owner-operators cannot use PC to travel to or from home for business purposes. That would be a deviation from the existing personal conveyance guidance, which, as we already talked about, does allow commute time in limited circumstances. And then to define yard move and draw clear lines between personal conveyance use or personal use and personal conveyance. So that's what we can expect with CVSA's upcoming petition. Thoughts on that, guys?
I mean, it works for Canada. So I don't know why it wouldn't work here, but
does it work for Canada?
I mean,
have you seen the data on it?
I don't have any stats on it, but I know that theirs is I think 2 hours a day, 2 hours a day, and there's a mileage limit actually with theirs too, but I don't remember what the mileage is. Well,
it's in kilometers.
But their hours of service is different, so it's hard to compare them. And
I would be interested to see the data, if the data exists, to see, because you're right. Canada, for I don't know how many years they've had it in place, but has a limitation like this, a temporal time restriction and also a distance limitation on personal conveyance. I think it might be 75 kilometers if I'm remembering correctly. And
yeah, I think that's what it is. But I mean, there's other rules for that, like they can't have trailers attached and things like that. So there's a lot more parts to that regulation. But it's kind of like their ELD rule. It's got to be certified by a real third party, and I mean their hours of service is a little different, but I mean even that begs the question of ELDs. Do ELDs hurt or help? But we can get into that.
Yeah, Jared's saying here Canada does have a 75 kilometer distance restriction per day after observing. He wants to know, do we think that limitations like that should be in place here in the U.S., and that's what CVSA is petitioning for. Brian, thoughts on that?
I think it makes.
Or go ahead, Rob.
Go ahead, Rob.
I think it makes sense because if you go back to what Brian said at the beginning, the basis and purpose of it is free time. Going to take a shower, going to eat, you can do what you want. And I mean, it's hard to say, hey, I'm going to go outside of 75 kilometers to not, to do something that's not in that scenario. So I don't know why it wouldn't work.
Brian.
Yeah. I look at the limitations that they want to put on, and I operated under some limitations. Ours was 1 hour per day. I don't think there was a mileage limit.
These were company imposed limitations.
These were company imposed, and this was back during the time where you couldn't be laden, and geez, that really seems like it solves a lot of the issues. And if you can't have a trailer, not just a loaded trailer, but a trailer at all, then that really limits what you can do with it. And I think CVSA, I know that they've challenged, they've asked for this multiple times. The reason I think they might have some teeth this time is that 38% number. And when they look at the enforcement side of things, and I've heard them say this at the meetings, that, log falsification is rampant. It's out of control. And it's at a level that they've never seen before. Well, number one, it was a lot harder to find on paper logs, but with the invents of the ELDs, it's just getting to a point where almost any log they look at, they can darn near find a falsification with.
Sam, thoughts on CVSA's approach here?
I'm kind of in favor of the FMCSA just getting out of the gray area. I mean, as we've kind of talked about before, the PC use is such a gray area on so many different things. Like, I'm all in favor of them defining it a little bit more, whether or not I agree with what they're trying to do or not. Like, that always seems to be the biggest deal, is like, just there's so much gray area. It's open for so much interpretation on a lot of this stuff. And one of the things that I've run across with drivers is that I'll tell them, hey, you can't do that. Like driving home, can't do that under PC. That's a falsification of law. Well, but they've been pulled over before doing that, and the DOT officer has let them go. So they think that they're doing exactly what they should be doing. So if there's a way that the FMCSA can define PC a little bit better, whether that's putting on limits on mileage or time or whatever, I'm okay with that. I'm a little hesitant to put that stuff on there just because I know drivers that use personal conveyance correctly, and that they're driving a long distance under PC legitimately. So I mean, there is a kind of a pro and con with that limitation. But I'm all for the FMCSA defining personal conveyance a little bit more, getting out of the gray area.
Well, I think 2 hours is really, really generous. And, in some situations, you can get down 120 miles down the road or better in a couple hours, depending on where you're at and time of day and stuff like that. But so that seems really generous on their part.
And I'm not saying it's not generous. I'm just saying, like, I've seen uses of it where they've gone more than 2 hours and it's completely legitimate use.
Right.
But, is it where we need to bring it down to 20 or to 2 hours because we're at 38% of illegitimate uses? Is it like, okay, we kind of we gave you the keys to the candy store. Maybe we need to take the keys back and define what you can and cannot do.
Well, clarity is a big thing because you've got so much misinformation. Like, drivers talk a lot. And Sean Duffy said this recently when he was talking about English proficiency. It's like drivers communicate really well, maybe too much. But if you can find something that justifies that provides a narrative that even if it's misinformation, that justifies the mindset, even if it's incorrect, they'll run with it. Like, the safe haven thing is a great example. It's like, I've always been told by Brian and Brandon and everybody else I've seen at the truck stops that I can use safe haven, so I must be able to use safe haven.
I didn't.
And then you just need that clarity.
Yeah,
somebody needs to define it better.
Yeah, I don't have much hope that FMCSA could ever define it in a way that wouldn't lead us right back into this same situation. It's just the nature of the beast. If we are going to allow drivers to operate their vehicles in off-duty status, I don't see how you do it any other way. Because even if you put time and distance restrictions on it, what are you doing there? You're not cutting down on the potential for log falsifications, right? Because you could still be within 2 hours and still be misusing personal conveyance status. What you're really doing with that is you are cutting down on the egregious misuses of it, and hopefully maybe cutting down on fatigue driving resulting from them continuing to drive in personal conveyance status beyond 2 hours. It's not getting to the heart of the issue is my point. I don't know how you get to the heart of the issue on this particular issue without doing what the FMCSA has already done, which is to put a list together of legitimate uses and illegitimate uses, and then keep tackling it as carriers and drivers come up with new creative ways that don't fit neatly in any of those categories. But then you're always just going to be chasing the issue, right? You're going to be continuing to add to that guidance. It's going to get more unwieldy as we go. So I don't know. That's just the pessimist in me, but I don't think we're ever going to get control of it. I think it's going to continue to plague the industry And so that brings us to the question of, assuming we're still going to have personal conveyance in some form or fashion going forward, which I have no doubt we will, what can carriers and drivers do, in your opinion, to best get control of this? If we can't look to the government to get control of it, what can carriers and drivers do to get control of it? I've got some thoughts, but I'll turn it over to you guys to give me yours first.
I think it's got to be just like anything else. I mean, everything that your regs and rules or laws have to be governed by something, whether it's a rule book or a policy, right? So how you draft a policy, the language of your policy, and then how you ultimately enforce it and hold people accountable for the policy. So clarifying PC policy to drivers, and even if you have to break it down in those specific example sets like FMCSA does to your team, then that's really the only way that you can manage it from a dumbed down, localized perspective.
Yeah, take a look at your own fleet and your characteristics of how your drivers are using personal conveyance and address those in your personal conveyance policy as a fleet. Even if FMCSA doesn't address it in theirs, you know how your fleet acts and how they use it. And if you're seeing ways that drivers are misusing it, then for sure address it in your policy. I think that's a good approach.
To me, it's not difficult. Like if you 80% of our fleets are ELD, right? So, I mean, you pull a PC report, and that's not going to give you everything. I mean, you probably still need to drill down some, but that'll give you a good high level point to say, hey, let's just focus on what the machine tells us. Like, see where we're failing the most.
Going back a little bit to, one of the bullet points that was on that sheet that you had.
Yeah.
Defining it as something other than off duty. It sounds to me like they're going to want a line 5.
Which some ELDs kind of do anyway, right? I mean, some ELDs will distinguish between personal conveyance and off-duty time.
Yeah, and I took a stand with a company that I was the safety manager for, and I put message after message out that because that ELD did not have a way to put any sort of limitations on it. Yeah, it was either all or nothing, and I couldn't even take one guy out, leave one driver in. Or anything like that. So the messages started going out that, look, we're using this improperly. If we continue to use it improperly, I'm going to shut it off for the whole fleet. And it actually came to that. And
I think fleets need to give serious consideration to that. Troy points this out on LinkedIn. Turn PC off when you can. That's the first thing. If I encounter a fleet that's having systemic personal conveyance misuse, my first question to them is, do your drivers need to be legitimately using personal conveyance or not? In other words, are your drivers even running up against their substantive time limits such that they need to occasionally legitimately use personal conveyance to get themselves where they need to go legitimately? And if the answer is no, our drivers aren't even running up against the 11-hour or 14-hour time limits, my advice is turn personal conveyance off because you don't need it. And by allowing drivers to use it, you're only operating in a gray area that you don't need to be operating in, and you're causing you're causing more trouble for yourself than you really need to be. So if you can turn it off, turn it off. That's the best approach in my opinion. But of course, there are lots of drivers and lots of fleets that need to have that flexibility that personal conveyance allows. But then you're right back into the situation of having to make sure that drivers are legitimately using it. And that's where I think these pieces of advice from Rob and Brian, and we'll hear from Sam here in a second, come into play. Namely, you need a policy in place. We always recommend all fleets have a personal conveyance policy if you're going to allow it. That puts controls around it so that, whether it's a time and distance, you'll see a lot of fleets that have their own time and distance limitations on personal conveyance use. That's probably the most common control you'll see implemented by a lot of fleets. They will say no more than an hour or 50 miles per day of personal conveyance use is a common one that I see, but it could really be anything you want. So stuff like that can go a long way. Sam, you have any other ideas?
Those are great ideas. What Brian and Rob said is what you need to do. The one piece that I want to bring up, and we don't have time to discuss this really, but the biggest legitimate piece of personal conveyance I see is, I think Rob said it before, when you're getting loaded, you run out of your hours and you have to PC to safe haven. I think we need to, or the FMCSA or somebody needs to start educating shippers and receivers. Like, hey guys, these drivers that are sitting in your docks for 4 to 10 to 12 hours, you got to get these guys out of here. They're up against their time limits here. And if you could get that whole industry, the shippers and receivers, to figure out that, hey, we need to load or unload these guys in a timely fashion, then you have a really legitimate argument to just turning PC off. Because again, that's the biggest one I see a lot of times, is guys just sitting and sitting and sitting and running out of their clock, and then they have to use PC, and they didn't even want to, So I think
talk about perennial issues. Waiting time in our industry is a perennial issue that, you're right, plays directly into this issue as well, and it's just something that we haven't been able to get control of in and of itself. So I think that's a good point.
And it seems to be getting worse.
That's an education piece if you can get your drivers to learn how to understand a split log. A lot of the refrigerated carriers have done a better job than other ones in teaching their guys how to do that, because grocery warehouses obviously are notorious for holding you 6 or 7 hours, but not long enough to get a full break in. But at least you can get out of there. What are you laughing at, Bob?
I'm laughing at reefer. I was thinking, when I ran seafood, we run 5 log books, and that would solve all these issues.
There you go. Yeah. I would just like to have Brian explain the 8-2 split right now. Just tell us exactly how that works.
You've got 2 minutes, Brian.
Yeah, right. I can. Yeah. Let me just draw it out for you, and I'll give it to you.
All right, guys, we're about out of time here. Anything else we need to hit on the topic of personal conveyance?
Auto assignment from ELDs was the only one I had. I mean, not all of them are going to do it, but some systems do auto assign time to PC, so someone has to manage those things.
What do you mean by that?
Some systems will automatically assign some time segments to personal conveyance on its own.
On what basis? I've never heard of this.
Yes, however it's programmed. I don't know.
Like the driver has put themselves in off-duty status and the system somehow converts it to personal conveyance? That sounds illegal to me.
No, it does it. I'll get something on it, but it does it.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but But yeah, the other point, Rob, that you mentioned earlier, I think is a good one too. The importance of watching your personal conveyance report in your system. Not enough carriers are doing this. Most likely, not all systems, but most systems nowadays will allow you to run a personal conveyance report. And what we recommend you do with that is run the report, see, and what I like to do, particularly if you're a large fleet and are trying to get your arms wrapped around this quickly, is to filter or sort that report by the drivers who are using it the most. Who has the biggest segments of personal conveyance use, and start with them and make sure that they understand, well, first of all, make sure that they're using it properly. And if not, then you can start working your way down that list of re-educating, retraining the drivers on personal conveyance use. And that can go a long way to get your worst offenders taken care of first. All right, let's see here. Any other comments on LinkedIn or YouTube? I think that's about it. All right, guys. Well, I guess we will wrap it up there. Appreciate you all joining me. Appreciate everybody else for tuning in today. We could go on and on talking about that topic. We've got a lot of content on that topic, specifically on trucksafe.com is where you'll find that. Be sure to follow us on our various social media channels to stay up to date on the latest highway transportation news and analysis, and stay tuned in for our next Trucksafe Live episode. We usually do 1 or 2 of these a month. Trucksafelive.com is where you can find information about future shows. You can watch past shows, you can read guest bios and that type of stuff. Also be sure to subscribe to Trucksafe Live wherever you happen to get your podcast. Thanks everybody. We'll see you later.